1884 by Michael Gray. Performed by Kristin Holland. It was all Tesla's fault. Or his kindness, perhaps, depending on your discretion. Nikola Tesla was the most dangerous man on Earth, but only those very few who had read the most deeply of all could have guessed it. Desperate to prove the safety of his alternating current, he undertook increasingly drastic public demonstrations. The grandest of these was the floating battery barge, the Future. It was an unfortunately apt name. The world's press and assorted dignitaries gathered at Liverpool docks to listen to the genius describe his latest creation. The new boat was to harvest an entire storm front, hold its captured electricity for a while, and then safely and harmlessly discharge all that unfathomable power into the ocean. The demonstration was an incredible success, according to an attending reporter who wired his editor from the boat. Just an hour later, though, the Future was gone, sunk into the calm sea, cause unknown. With it went Tesla and 56 journalists, industrialists and crewmen. In the aftermath, an odd spree of coastal abductions and impersonations barely caused a stir. A few days later, Her Imperial Majesty the Queen Victoria announced subtle amendments to her titles and honours, and, it was noted, to her voice and manner and preferences. The Future, such as it had been, was quietly forgotten. Martin Fisher was thinking about the girl again. The little match seller had worked at the junction of Dawkins Row and Fletcher Street. She could not have been older than 9, and had done nothing more unlawful than stand on the wrong street on the wrong day. It had been his first arrest for dissent, under one of a slew of new laws brought in since Her Most Ancient and Imperial Majesty had assumed that title. What was to have been a quiet affair turned into a brawl when the man he tried to arrest bolted into the streets. Fisher gave chase, finally tripping him on the corner of Dawkins Row, just yards from the matchstick girl, and held him there until the wagon arrived. Those wagons were another new thing, painted matte black, windowless, and devoid of ornamentation, bar the Queen's new coiled seal, done in silver on the door. The agency's men, the Black Hoods, jumped wordlessly from their ride. They took custody of the dissenter, pulling him from Fisher's embrace on the ground and forcing him towards the wagon. He fought them and screamed wild accusations the whole way to the carriage. What he shrieked, Fisher could not remember. His attention had been on the girl, drawn by the force of some cruel prescience. The Hoods waited until the man was by the wagon, already shivering from its cold miasma, before they opened the door. The sunlight couldn't touch the utter darkness of its interior, yet the girl stared into it, fixated. The man was thrown in and the door slammed. The carriage rocked in time with his muted shouts, once, twice. Then it fell still and silent. That was when the girl started screaming. Fisher had watched the colour seep from her face as she looked into the carriage. Her abject terror had kept her silent, denied her dread a voice. Why could she not have held on? If she'd lasted 30 seconds more, the carriage, the Black Hoods, and their unfortunate passenger would all have been gone. But she'd failed. The Hoods turned, first staring at the girl, then looking at each other. Body language gave away their uncertainty, and for a moment Fisher thought he might be able to save her, pick her up and carry her away. Then the man climbed down from the driver's bench. Fisher didn't know his name. It was the first time he had seen him, but even so, on that first day, he knew one of them when he saw one. The man moved oddly, walking as if unused to just 2 legs, while the others all wore those black hoods. He was undisguised, his face bare. It was all the more chilling that this fellow, so otherwise undistinguished, would allow everyone to see his face and know what he did, whom he served, what he was. He walked to the girl, still screaming, still staring, and reached down to take her hand. "What are you doing?" asked Fisher, somehow finding his voice. The man looked at him. His expression was enigmatic, but gave the faint impression of confusion, as if at dinner a bowl of stew had quietly asked not to be eaten.
The girl saw.
His voice was like his gait, staggered and ungainly. She has done nothing, Fisher said. He forced himself to step between them and the wagon.
The girl saw,
he said again.
She will come.
No, Fisher shook his head. The girl had fallen silent, but she still stared at the ominously still wagon.
She will come, or you will come, Officer Fisher.
It was the way the bare-faced man had said his name, rather than the fact that he knew it at all. God help him, but he'd stepped aside and let the man go. Let her go. He had visited that corner every week since, and every week he stood there alone for an hour before wandering home. The rest of his free time, he attempted to remain in drunken oblivion.
Officer Fisher!
Fisher flinched and looked up from the table. Silence had replaced the regular hubbub of the inn around him. The bare-faced man stood above him, towering over the table and its empty gin bottles. He didn't know how the man had found him, and didn't ask. They'd have found him wherever he was. What? He laid his head back down on his arms to ease the painful thumping.
Officer Martin Fisher, you are wanted.
The memory was still too raw for him to summon much concern. Yes? And what am I wanted for?
You are wanted at the palace, Officer Fisher.
His eyes snapped open. Why?
You are wanted at the palace, Officer Fisher. Tomorrow, 9 o'clock.
The man turned and walked away. The noise of the inn returned by degrees, reassuring him that the man had gone. He is not truly gone, Fisher thought. They never will be. France was mobilizing, according to the Times. The rest of Europe watches the second rise of the British Empire with jealousy, it declared. With fear seemed the more likely truth. Britain truly ruled the waves, and continental fleets had been sunk, or just gone missing. So France prepared to defend her shores with her old war machines, the tractor-pulled basilics with their flame-throwing cannon, the repeating rifles of the Grande Armée, even the almost legendary Earth Movers. My great-granddad fought against the Earth Movers, Fisher overheard one old man say to another as he walked by St. James's Park.
He never did. He'd be dead, and you'd not be here.
He did true. He were at Waterloo. Said there were 4 of them, and had his generalship not had his agents fix 'em proper before, the battle would have gone the other way. Like moving castles, he said they were, with cannons the size of barges.
They won't help, Fisher wanted to say. The biggest guns in the world can't help you when it only takes one in an army, just a single one of them to reach one of your officers, and then it's all over. He kept his mouth shut. Either one of them could have been an informer, or a Black Hood. The hoods were everywhere, with and without their black hoods, becoming the everyday people of the street. The man behind you at the pie stall, a woman in the crowd at the playhouse, or one of a pair of old men leaning against a wall swapping tales, listening to what they heard around them, and remembering every name and face. He found it hard to despise the hoods. They were just people, like him, caught in times where you did what you had to do if you wanted to survive. But even if he couldn't find hate for them, he still guarded his words and actions. It was madness not to. So he went on his way, leaving the 2 old men to their stories. The frightening thing about Buckingham Palace, the most insidious arrogance, was how much it had not changed. The Scots Guard arrayed themselves around the gates, but it was otherwise the same. It told London that they were not frightened of the people. We do not have to defend ourselves from you. The only notable difference to the palace was the state of the telegraph towers, steepling wooden poles that had connected the Queen to the air dock towers at Greenwich. The telegraphs had fallen into disrepair now, the wires dangling useless, and the poles split with rot. The palace had no use for them, not since the continental governments cut communication. As for the air docks themselves, they hated anything which took them further away from water. He presented himself to the gate. The guard there just snapped his heels and asked Fisher to follow, marching off to a side door. Fisher did so, and was led through antechambers and narrow halls, into a book-lined study and out, and finally to a gallery with high ceilings and windows, and an unlit hearth at its centre. The guard left, after instructing him to wait. And wait he did, standing in the spot he'd been left in. Fear that being discovered out of place would earn a punishment rooted him to the spot. But minutes passed, and then tens of minutes, until boredom more than bravery sent him over to look at the paintings along the wall. They were so many, and so large. The first was a seascape featuring a battle of 100 ships. He recognized HMS Victory in the fray, and surmised that the artist had depicted Trafalgar. He admired the bold strokes and fine detail. Everything was captured through the smoke and movement of battle. He moved on to the next, and found himself at a loss. It showed a land battle, although he couldn't identify the regiments, or even the armies. Two sides fought in a barren landscape under a red sky, not the red of sunset either. Fisher got the impression of a sky deliberately and perpetually crimson, with black clouds sailing over the ruined scenery. The men who fought did so not with an appearance of determination or pride, but with the wild delight of zealots. Even those caught in the blasts of cannon or pierced with bayonets seemed to have no regrets, no sadness. It was as if they would gleefully die or kill for their cause, and welcomed either with equal relish.
Magnificent, are they not?
He caught himself, crushed the urge to spin, and managed to turn, calmly. A man walked towards him, slim and unassuming, dressed well but somberly. He was pale, too. What Fisher had first taken for a powdered wig of the old style was in fact a shock of grey hair, and the man's cheeks weren't rouged, but bore the redness found under the rimmed eyes of someone who had not slept well in a long time. "They are," he said, keeping his voice pleasant and agreeable. "These," the man pointed to the Trafalgar painting and its neighbours, "were originally hanging in the National Gallery." He waved past the last painting Fisher had looked at. "These others were... well, I'm not exactly sure where they came from, but Her Majesty desired them hung." Fisher's glance followed the man's gesture. He saw more of the paintings of the latter sort. The next in line was dominated by the livid greens of rainforest. Vines and grass crept up a statue which hurt his eyes when he tried to focus. He blinked and looked back at the man. "Sorry, sir, I am at a disadvantage," he said. "Of course, my apologies. My name is Benjamin Disraeli. I have the good fortune to be the Prime Minister for Her Most Ancient and Imperial Highness. May she live forever." Fisher recognized the man then. What he had become, anyway. Disraeli had been Prime Minister before Tesla's demonstration, and had remained so. There was never a question of elections being held, but the man bore little resemblance to the vital, energized pictures in newspapers and posters. It occurred to him that Disraeli's portrayal in the news sheets had not altered with time. The fellow you could see in the papers today was years past his date, and bore little resemblance to the withered, hunted man before him. "May she live forever," Fisher echoed. Disraeli smiled as if he were pleased to hear him repeat the phrase. "And you would be Officer Martin Fisher. I am glad you could make it at such short notice. Your reputation precedes you. Not many individuals have worked to make the Empire safe as you have." "I do my duty as best I can, sir." Quite. Disraeli turned and began to escort Fisher down the gallery. The Prime Minister's arms were crossed behind his back, shoulders a little slumped. "I presume you were told nothing about why you were called?" Fisher shook his head, careful not to look at any of the paintings on either side. "Such are the ways of some of our people. We require a service of you, Mr. Fisher, something beyond your usual remit. Tell me, do you know much about your great-grandmother?" That gave him pause. "Do you mean Joanna Fisher?" "The very same." She caused some stir in her day. She hunted ghosts and spirits, sir, and advocated suffrage for women. She did that, yes, but I'm referring to her marriage. She was married? Fisher was surprised enough to stop. Disraeli paused. Why, yes. It was very hush-hush. I believe she thought it would damage her public image as a strong, independent woman or some such. That it was not common knowledge in your family surprises me, though. He nodded that they should continue. Your grandfather was born inside wedlock, Mr. Fisher, and that is why we need you. They reached the gallery's end and stood before an arched double door. Disraeli twisted the handle one half-turn, then paused. You have not been in the presence of royalty, have you, Mr. Fisher? Please try and remain calm. He twisted, pushed, and stepped through. The room seemed cramped after the scale of the gallery. Tall windows on the right-hand wall allowed anemic light to fall in, highlighting the shadows rather than illuminating the room. A hearth, set but unlit, dominated the far wall. A rug of complex patterns and hunting animals covered most of the floor, and in its centre, on a stick-thin chair, sat the Queen. She wore her customary black and faced the windows, showing the door her profile. Her head tilted slightly back, mouth and eyes open and unmoving. Fisher wondered if she had heard their entrance. If she had, there was no sign. But even so, Disraeli placed his palms together and gave a short bow. Your Supreme Majesty, may I present Officer Martin Fisher? There was no response. Stuttering, Fisher said, It is an honour, Your Majesty.
You are welcome here, Martin Fisher.
The words were cold and layered, and seemed to enter his head without touching his ears. He blinked, but Her Majesty had not moved, offering only the same still profile. Thank you, ma'am.
You are confused. That is to be expected. Come, stand before us where we can see you in the light.
He looked at Disraeli, who nodded, so he edged around towards the windows. Halfway through his circuit, he stopped, took a quick breath, and swallowed the scream clawing up his throat. He stood obliquely to her, enough to see that she sat as one would expect any other person to sit, straight-backed, hands crossed on her lap. But he could not take another step, save at his sanity's risk. Mottled grey tentacles fingered through the Queen's hair. One tip protruded from her bun, waving as if it were a snake's tongue tasting the air. Another was plastered across her forehead, curling around her face, framing it. The narrow end was feeling around inside her open mouth. Within that insane vision he spotted a pallid inflation at the other side of her head, something slickly damp, which rose and fell like a breathing sack. Nothing on earth could have compelled him to move even 1 inch further, but he forced himself to stand his ground.
Do not be alarmed, Martin Fisher. We are aware of how we appear, but we are in no discomfort.
I am... He glanced at Disraeli, who nodded. Gladdened to hear so, ma'am.
You are a good subject, Martin Fisher. You do much which promotes the stability of our empire. We ask of you another task.
Of course, Your Majesty.
Benjamin Disraeli?
Your Majesty. Disraeli walked over with another bow. What Her Most Ancient and Imperial Majesty requires, Mr. Fisher, is an envoy to France. Since the misunderstanding with our last ambassador, France has refused to meet with anyone of royal blood. Their reactions to our attempts at contact range from hostile to downright violent. However, we believe they would accept you as a messenger for the crown. Me? Indeed. You see, your great-grandfather was French, a gentleman by the name of Michel Doriol, the younger son of a landowner from Anjou. The marriage was performed and consummated in France. However, your great-grandmother returned to England pregnant with your grandfather, while Monsieur Doriol, for reasons unknown to the crown, remained in France and slipped beyond reach of our records. This would allow me entry to the country? Yes, your heritage gives you a favourable light in the eyes of the Directorate. We have already made inquiries in that regard. Fisher's eyes flicked between Disraeli and the Queen. Did he dare entertain the thoughts threatening to creep into his mind? Would they be able to hear them? His gaze shifted to the thing attached to Victoria's face. He could not think of it and her as a single being, the way Disraeli apparently could. He could almost feel it extending those tentacles towards him, invisible and knowing, reaching into his mind. He closed off the thought before it could take root. "I would be honoured, Your Majesty."
"We are pleased to hear so, Martin Fisher." The layered voice was all around him. He desperately fought an urge to look behind himself. "Excellent." Disraeli clapped his hands together. "Travel arrangements are already in place, Mr. Fisher. You will depart tonight. An airship has been refurbished for this purpose. The speed is beneficial, and it will show our neighbours that we are more willing to be adaptable than they give us credit for." An airship! Fisher suppressed a smile. He would be out of the country in a day. He could run, vanish, never be heard of again. The door he'd entered through opened up. In came a servant in the royal livery, holding a silver tray. "We have a range of proposals we wish for you to deliver to the French Directorate," the Prime Minister said. The servant approached. The tray bore a bulging folder tied with a red ribbon, and a small wooden box. "You won't be negotiating, simply delivering the package to their hands. You will find a top sheet with a brief description of the salient points, so you can converse over the main topics if need be. But you are not to promise anything beyond what is laid out in the documents. And there is this." Disraeli took the box, holding it at the corners by his fingertips, and, almost reverentially, lifted it up to the light. 1.5 inches square, it resembled a threepenny snuff-box. It looked a little odd, however. The wood was dark brown, almost black, with a smoothness which suggested age rather than polish. There were no discernible grooves to hint at a lid. "What is it?" "You will be staying in the Paris residence with Monsieur Eugène Spuller, the Minister for Foreign Affairs. At some point in your stay, you must deposit this in his chamber." Fisher looked closer at the box. "Why?" "That is something you do not need to know," Disraeli said, and offered it to him. "And what do I do afterwards?" As he took it, he felt its weight shifting, as if it held liquid. "Nothing whatsoever. Just place it in the room, preferably somewhere unnoticeable. Mention it to no one. Complete your task and return home." He lifted it to the light, holding it as the Prime Minister had. "You need not be so delicate, Mr. Fisher," Disraeli said. "Martin Fisher is observing the Reverend's ode,"
the Queen's voice said inside his head.
"Complete this task, Martin Fisher, and you will be rewarded. We will not forget your service." "We never forget." It was the first time Fisher had been on an airship. It was more turbulent than he anticipated, and the gondola swung heavily below the balloon as the winds buffeted the ship across the channel. At first, he had been disappointed to be travelling at night. It would have been nice to see England from the air. From up here, he could have pretended it was still the country he grew up in. Instead, he screwed his eyes closed and forced an image of the match cellar into his mind. This was no longer his home, and he would be damned if he would have a part in its future. He kept his eyes closed, only opening them as the sun dawned, when the pilot finally announced their descent. Where London sprawled, Paris seemed to have grown organically out from a central point, like tree roots. Where London was smothered in perpetual fog, the air here was clear, showing every building and every person walking its streets in fine contrast. As his ship slipped towards the air docks at Montmartre, the strength of the French army stood to attention, arranged in regimented blocks, ready to greet his delegation of one. The airship was directed to dock at the lowest port in the tower, and he felt sure this was to give him more time to gaze over France's might. At the lift's exit, he was met with a corridor of bayonets. Entire regiments bordered a red carpet at the dock's entrance, leading him to his host. The walk took several minutes, past row after row of stone-faced soldiers resplendent in sky blue, but he kept his gaze on the end of the carpet. At first,
He thought they were two small fortresses, strangely rounded against the angular architecture of the city, lined with crenellations and spiked with long-barreled rifles. It was not until he saw the immense cannons that he realized what he was looking at. "Earth movers," he whispered. The silent threat France had held against Britain for nearly a century was there for him to see. 2 of them. He wished he had time to look more closely to see how they had negotiated the winding streets of Paris, but he was at the carpet's end, facing a smiling man with an outstretched hand. "Monsieur Fischer?" "I am, sir." He took the hand, shaking firmly. "And you would be Monsieur Spuller?" "Just so. Welcome to France." Spuller opened his arms, in essence a welcome, but with a sweep which took in the armed forces surrounding them. Fischer took heart at the power of the country he intended to call on for asylum. Fischer allowed the rest of the morning to unfold as it would, and Spuller seemed to take pleasure in acting the guide. The minister showed him each regiment on the air dock grounds, one after the other, and then took him on a walking tour of the streets. It was disconcerting at first, seeing so many people out and about, smiling and talking openly. He heard unrestrained laughter for the first time in an eon, and struggled to keep the tears from his eyes. "Are you enjoying yourself, monsieur?" It was not the first time Spuller had asked. "Very much so, sir. There is something I would like to know, however. Were those earth movers I saw before?" Spuller looked blank for a moment, then laughed. "Le trompe de terre? Indeed, you are quite correct. They have been brought out of retirement. There has been much advancement in weaponry since they were last used. You understand, Monsieur Fischer, your Empress has not shown the best of faith in her dealings with Europe, and we must move to defend ourselves." "Very understandable, sir. However, I would suggest that perhaps attacks from the air would be more effective." He stopped and looked into his host's eyes. His words were treason. Aiding a foreign power, even through intelligence, was a capital crime. Spuller could not have missed his intent, and Fischer was elated to see a twinkle in the man's eye. "We had thought so too. Have no fear in that regard. The privateers of the Alps have aligned themselves with our cause. Should it come to it, we will dominate the skies as we will the land." The pirates of the Swiss Alps. Hope flared. If France had truly managed to unite the unruly air captains, they would be able to bomb England into submission. Up there, in the sky, they had no reach. Fischer felt a smile steal over him. "Ah, but look at the time, monsieur. You must be famished. Let us retire to my residence, where we can speak privately." "I would like that very much, sir." Dinner was luxury itself. Beef in a delicate sauce, served with vegetables cooked in a way he'd never known was possible, washed down with a heady red wine. Fischer found himself in pleasant company. The group consisted of Monsieur Spuller and his charming wife, along with 2 generals, introduced as Henri de Beaune and Laurent de Chalut, and a Captain Johann Schneider, who did not wear the blue uniform of the generals. They sat around the dinner table, behind empty plates and full glasses. Madame Spuller had retired to another room, and Fischer allowed himself to relax in an easy atmosphere he'd forgotten could exist. General de Beaune was finishing the tale of a smuggler band he had once chased, and had everyone belly laughing at how his troops had marched past the same barn 3 times without realizing the men they hunted were inside. Spuller seemed particularly taken by the tale, more than once begging the general to stop while he wiped a tear from his eye. "Please, General, you will make me cry." Fischer noted that Captain Schneider, whilst smiling, had not joined in with the laughter. "You did not enjoy the general's story, sir?" Schneider offered him a brief smirk. "I have heard it before, monsieur." "Yes, our general is a famous storyteller," said Spuller. He collected himself. "I am afraid we must speak of more sober things, messieurs." He placed his hand on the file Fischer had presented earlier. "I have yet to read your proposals, Monsieur Fischer. However, I believe I can guess with some accuracy what they will be. And I'm afraid we will not be able to accept them." Fisher had come to the same realization during the day, and welcomed it. He had made up his mind. All that was left was finding the correct way in which to make his request. "The Queen will be saddened to hear that, sir." "And will it be you who delivers this sad news?" asked Captain Schneider. Fisher found himself disliking the way Schneider had leaned in as he spoke. The captain had remained distant through the evening, up till now. "Perhaps," he said. "What will your role be, Captain?"
"Oh, nothing grand. I am a delegate for the other captains in Switzerland."
"Captain Schneider is here as a spokesman for the Allied Swiss air captains, Monsieur Fisher," said Spuller.
Fisher felt a sudden warmth towards the Swiss man. "Then I must express my honor at meeting you, sir. You head a formidable force. And perhaps this is an opportune time to ask you something, Monsieur Spuller. You see," without conscious awareness of reason, he turned back to Schneider, as all the other eyes around the table were on him. The Swiss captain opened his mouth. There in the darkness he saw something move, too thin, too grey to be a tongue. It darted forward quickly, barely protruding from his lips, and flapped briefly in the air, as if to taste it. Captain Schneider's mouth closed, and it was gone, taking with it Fisher's moment, his body heat, and all the hope he had left in the world.
"Oui, monsieur?"
said Spuller. Fisher could not take his eyes from Schneider, who smiled in a way that made him shiver. Where is your toilet, sir?" Fisher rolled the box over in his hands, feeling the cold emanate from it in clammy waves. He still did not see what it could be, but he understood that it would tip the balance of history. He closed his eyes and sighed. He had been a fool to think he could run. He knew now with absolute certainty that his kind were no longer masters of their own destiny. One man could not hope to stand in their way. God help him, any God left. He dared not face them as an enemy. He realized that he'd been standing outside Spuller's bedchamber for too long. The others would come and look for him soon. He twisted the handle, both relieved and revolted that it wasn't locked, and walked in. He purposefully avoided looking at the hints of female occupancy, the scarves hanging from the hat stand, the tiny perfume bottles on the dresser, the elegant silver-backed hand mirror, and made his way over to the bed. As carefully as he dared, he placed the box on the floor and pushed it beneath. Disgusted with himself, he turned and left, pausing at the door as he heard something hollow, something wooden, tip onto floorboards. He did not want to look. He wanted nothing more than to close the door, go home, and slip into a sleep from which, if there was any mercy left in the world, he would never wake up. But something beyond his control, some base human urge to know, turned him. Beneath the bed, the box lay in two halves. The hollow sides were open to the world. A viscous slick led away into the shadows beneath the bed. The alliance with France was greeted with cheers across London. Street parties were allowed as France reopened its embassy in Knightsbridge. Whitehall took the opportunity to announce the joint Anglo-French war on Spain and Prussia, while Austria-Hungary ended its policy of neutrality to join the alliance, after a visit from a French delegation. Martin Fisher rested his head on the inn's faithful table, gently rattling the empty bottles surrounding him. The Queen had been true to her word. She had offered him anything he wanted, and he had asked to be free. He walked from the palace a free man, no longer an officer of the agency. He bore no delusions, though. His liberty was nothing more than a thinly draped disguise. It was less than a day before he saw the bare-faced man in the street, standing with a flag-waving crowd, watching him with an awful patience. They would come for him, and he found that he no longer